Good afternoon. I'm finished with my series on the 2006 World Chess Championship match, and now I'll go back and begin with the World Championship match before that. Now, as I have said, in 1993 there was a split in the chess world. Garry Kasparov and Nigel Shorts had agreed terms for their World Championship match, and FIDE later agreed on a settlement that gave the players much less money, and much more money went to FIDE. And Kasparov, rightly enough, didn't think this was fair, and set up his own World Chess Championship as a protest against FIDE's decision. And so it wasn't until 2006 before the two competing World Championships were united again. So the previous time when the World Championship match was undisputed was in 1990, 16 years before. It's the longest delay in the World Championship history. There was a 9-year delay between matches before 1907, whilst the world champion Emanuel Lasker completed his doctoral thesis and his studies to become a doctor of mathematics. And there was a 12-year delay between the rematch between Max Euwe and Alexander Alekhine, and when Botvinnik became world champion. A great deal of this was because of the Second World War, but then after the Second World War, Alekhine died as world champion, and it took a couple of years after that to organise a tournament. So the 16 years from 1990 to 2006 is the longest there has been since the World Championship started without a World Championship match. So the two competitors are reigning champion Garry Kasparov and challenger Anatoly Karpov. These two have challenged one another a fair number of times, and we have to go back to 1972 before we find a World Championship match which didn't feature one of these two players, Karpov and Kasparov. What can I say about these two players? Karpov, the boa constrictor, a typical description of. Sorry, I'll just get rid of that analysis. Typical description of Karpov's play is that 60 moves, nothing happens, and then Karpov wins. He was really good at making sure that the opposition didn't really get any chances in the game. Boa constrictor, crushing the life out of his opponents. Garry Kasparov, known as the Beast from Baku, or the Beast with 100 eyes, really, really energetic as a person, as a personality, as a chess player, always really well prepared, always had lots of clever variations, whatever the opening, he worked out something that others hadn't thought of, and this was really before the age when computers were better than people at chess. And I think Karpov and Kasparov are definitely names that should be included when we think about who might be the greatest chess player of all time. I won't argue with anybody who tells me that they think Garry Kasparov is the greatest of all time, or anybody who tells me that Magnus is the greatest of all time. I personally think it's Magnus, but if you want to tell me that you think Gary's the greatest of all time, I'm not going to argue with you. You're perfectly entitled to that opinion. Probably not Karpov. Karpov, third or fourth. Third or fourth shared with Vishy Anand. Fifth, Fischer. That's my opinion. Sixth, Capablanca, if you're interested. That's seventh is probably Alekhine, and eighth is probably Lasker, and you can fill in the rest of the details yourself. But that's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. But undoubtedly, Karpov and Kasparov, who were both students of the great Mikhail Botvinnik, were two of the best, and and took part in some of the best matches. And they had a long series of matches from 1985 to 1990. It doesn't sound very long, but or 84, I think, the first match to 1990. But they played one another a huge number of times, and I think there was only 2 games difference between them, which settled 4 world championships. Before which Karpov himself had a great series of matches with probably the best defensive player of all time, Viktor Korchnoi. But let's get on with this. This was in 1990, and I think the first half was played in New York and the second half in Lyon, somewhere like that. I'll just check the details. Yeah, Lyon. So the first half of the match was in New York, and the second half was in Lyon. So this is game number 2, and Kasparov has the white pieces, and Karpov the dark pieces. E4, E5. It's like we're back in the 19th century. Knight to F3, knight to C6. Roy Lopez. Then, now, always has been the most popular opening in chess. Bishop to B5. The knight attacks the pawn. The knight comes on, defends the pawn. The bishop attacks the defender of the pawn. This isn't a way to win the pawn. You can't take the pawn and then take the pawn, because black would retake with the d pawn, taking away from the centre. When you take the pawn, he would have queen to d4, forking knight and pawn. So you can't win a pawn directly like that, but you're threatening it. So Karpov asks Kasparov if he really wants to take that bishop, or if he's just acting like he might. So he says, I'll decide afterwards. And then comes to f6 to threaten the pawn. But the pawn is defended by the rook on e1. What rook on e1? Well, the rook which will be on e1 as soon as you take it, after Kasparov castles. A little tactical way of defending the pawn, but it works. So bishop comes to e7. Now he could play d3 to defend the pawn, but instead he plays rook to e1. And the bishop is attacked again. You might think he could come and harass the bishop with knight to a5, but the pawn is not defended yet. So he defends the pawn first with d6. So Kasparov plays c3 in order to preserve this very important light squared bishop, so that if the knight comes here to threaten the bishop has c2, where it's safe from capture. So Karpov castles, and the pawn comes to h3. Bishop comes to b7. This is the Keres-Flohr-Zaitsev system. These days, usually just called the Zaitsev system. I think Carlsen has played this a good number of times in World Championship matches, and he's sometimes played, I think, against in some of the draws against Karyakin. He has played a system where the knight goes to b8 and then comes out again to b7, a complete shuffle of the pieces. So the pawn comes to d4, challenging the centre. Rook comes c8 to support the centre, and the knight comes to knight b to d2 to support the centre. And the bishop retreats to f8 so that the rook sees this pawn, so that it's properly defended. a4 wants to attack that structure. h6 and bishop to c2. Now that he's threatening to take it, he doesn't want this pawn to be taken with the tempo on the bishop. He wants to be able to decide for himself which piece to take it with and what to do. Pawn takes on d4, and the knight takes on d4. Knight comes to b4, threatening to win the bishop. Again, Kasparov is keen to preserve the light squared bishop. Bishop takes on a4 and the rook takes. Pawn comes to a5 to support the knight, and the rook retreats so that when bishop comes here, it isn't a tempo on the rook. The rook comes to a6 and the knight moves to h2 to come to g6, g5, where 4 even. I was bound to get it right one of these days, where it is in a good attacking position. Pawn comes to g6, and the knight comes to the pawn comes to f3 to defend this pawn, so that this knight is free to move. And the queen comes to d7. And the knight comes to c4, as I said, to attack this pawn with the bishop. Queen comes to b5, and the rook defends the knight. Bishop comes to c8, and the bishop comes to e3, threatening to take control of some important squares by playing d5. King comes to h7 to defend this pawn one more time in case white decides to play queen d2. Plays queen c1 instead, so to keep up supporting this knight, this rook, and this pawn at the same time as creating a battery against this pawn. Pawn comes to c6, and the knight comes to g4, threatening this pawn. Now it's threatened 3 times, so the knight falls back and it's defended once, twice, 3 times. Attacked 3 times, so he can't take first. But he does take first anyway. What's going on? Well, the idea is that when the bishop moves to take, then the d6 pawn is undefended. He doesn't really have much choice. He takes, knight takes back, and he takes the pawn. And now he's got 6 pawns against 4. Alright, he's a piece down, but he's threatening the queen, threatening the rook. He's going to get an exchange. And he does. And he plays queen takes d4 check, so that now it's 5 pawns against 4. So, yeah, exchange down and a pawn down. Exchange and a pawn down, yeah. So king goes to h1 and the queen comes to d8, so that the knight doesn't have a retreat square. So that actually it'll be ending up with 1, 2, 3 against 1 for his rook. So is that a good deal? No, it isn't, but he's got better ways to go around it. So he plays queen to e8, rook, queen takes e8, and the queen comes out, threatening the king, threatens to push this pawn. King comes to a6, rook comes to a7, and the queen is threatened by d8. Queen comes to d6, and the pawn pushes. He's threatened to push here. When it's taken, he can take, and then he's threatening the knight and other nastiness. Bishop comes to a6, and the pawn comes as advertised to f5. Queen comes to e7, and the rook is defended by the queen. Queen comes to e5, and the queen attacks the rook, not the knight, the rook, on e7. The rook is attacked by the queen, saying, I can take your rook, rather than defending my rook. Queen defends the rook, and the knight comes to g8. Pawn comes forward, threatened to play f6, and then the queen hasn't got a good square to defend the rook with. Knight comes to d5, cutting the rook off from support of the queen. He plays check again, pawn is taken, so now he's threatening to play bishop takes pawn here. But the rook is undefended. So now he's got 2 knights, and 2 knights for a rook and 2 pawns. big advantage to Kasparov here now. Pawn comes to d7, e7 even to queen. Knight comes to e7 even. Knight d comes to e7 to stop the check. Bishop falls, but when the queen checks, he picks up the piece. Comes back with a queen so that the piece isn't won. Queen comes to d2. Queen comes to f1 to defend the rook, and look at this square. And Karpov has seen enough. The check on f7, followed by bishop takes f6, will be enough to put the game to bed. Yeah. So Kasparov takes the lead in their 1990 Kasparov Karpov match. Kasparov Karpov, since Kasparov was a world champion. They were playing a 24-game match, as was standard at that time. And just before the match, Karpov suggested that since their games had been so even recently, the two championships before that, Kasparov won by a point in one of them, and the other one was a draw. And Kasparov retained his title. And he suggested that if it was a draw after 12 moves, after 24 games, they should fight on or share the title or some. I'm not exactly sure, but Kasparov just laughed and said, Mr. Karpov is the challenger. He has to beat the champion to claim the title. Yeah, I think that summed up his view. And Mr. Karpov spoke about the not most friendly relationship between the two players. But I think they had a great respect for one another because they were head and shoulders above every other player in the world in their time. Okay, don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe to my videos. Thanks, bye.